We are now recording, so nobody cuss. So where I left us off, people objected, not necessarily to the idea of some kind of evolution. People objected not to the idea of evolution itself, which again is just change over time, but to Darwin's specific idea that natural selection was the prime mover. Darwin is often said to have invented the theory of evolution. That's not exactly it. As I mentioned, the idea of life on Earth changing over time goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks. There was a Roman philosopher named Titus Carus Lucretius who played around a lot with the idea. And Lamarck was the first to come up with a theory of what was making evolution happen. But the idea that the Earth was very old and that the life on it had gone through many changes was actually pretty widely accepted even when Darwin was a student. Remember that people like his old geology teacher, Adam Sedgwick, were quite happy to invoke large periods of time and great changes in Earth history. So the idea that evolution had happened wasn't all that new, although Darwin did gather more evidence in support of it in one place than anybody had. He put together an awful lot of jigsaw pieces. But the other thing he's important for is coming up with a theory for what's making that change happen, and that is natural selection. And there were objections to the idea that natural selection was the prime mover of evolutionary change. As we've said, people like Lord Kelvin used physics to estimate the age of the Earth and argued that the Earth was not old enough for natural selection to have produced all of life, everything from the goo through the zoo to you. Darwin had always emphasized natural selection happening very, very gradually, very, very Lyell-like, where you take tiny changes and you add them up over huge periods of time. Kelvin argued there wasn't time for that to happen. So if evolution took place, it had to be caused by some process that could work more quickly. Fleming-Jenkin argued that there was no way natural selection could work because even if you did find an organism that varied in a favorable way, like a long-necked giraffe and a population of short necks, that favorable variant would have to breed with individuals that didn't have it, and that would dilute that favorable variation out, and it would eventually just get lost. You have the great big blind spot that nobody knows where variation is coming from, or how it can be inherited. I mean, we know that living things do vary, and we know that traits tend to be inherited, just the way that, I've got my father's eyes in a jar of formaldehyde. Okay, just checking to see who's listening here. I think some of you were just writing that down, in a jar of formaldehyde. I don't really have my dad's eyes in a jar of formaldehyde, but I've got similar eye coloring to his, and you, of course, have many features of your parents. So we know that variation and heredity happen, but nobody knows how. And finally, John Herschel pointed out that natural selection didn't look like good science because it's not like physics and astronomy. You can't really use it to make predictions. In some ways, evolution is a lot like human history in that you can gather a lot of data to understand, the American Civil War, or the Brazilian Empire, the reign of Dom Pedro I, or the history of Conway from its founding in the 1870s by a bunch of German Catholics who didn't like the Kaiser. You can gather data, you can explain why things happened, but you can't really predict the course of history. I mean, because there are always things happening that there's no way anybody could have foreseen. You know, nobody really knew there was going to be a pandemic in 2020 until it was actually happening. I mean, you can kind of predict that there will be new diseases emerging that will seriously inconvenience people, but nobody knew the details of that. You could kind of predict that Russia was going to be a bastard, but nobody really foresaw the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, until we noticed that they were building up troops on the border. But 5 years ago, it didn't look all that likely. 10 years ago, it didn't look all that likely. So evolution is more like that in that you can understand how evolution has happened in the past, but you're limited in what you can predict into the future. Whereas with astronomy, you know, we can predict the orbits of the planets hundreds of years from now. You know, we can launch probes to Jupiter and aim them so that they will do this kind of slingshots around other planets and then reach the place where Jupiter is going to be a couple of years from now. And we can do that because those laws have great predictive value. Evolution looked more like the law of higgledy-piggledy. So we talked about that, yeah. But Kelvin was answered beginning in 1895. That's when a French guy named Henri Becquerel discovered that if he stored his photographic film next to some rocks, the film got foggy as if it had been exposed to light. Even though he wrapped it up very carefully. The rocks turned out to be uranium ore, and that was the first discovery of this phenomenon called radioactivity. So here, around about 1900, you've got Marie and Pierre Curie. Curie, I think, was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in the sciences, and in fact, she won 2 of them. And they just finished working over something like a train car load of uranium ore and going over, you know, chemically extracting it over and over and over again. Yes?
Michaela is trying to enter.
I'm sorry?
Michaela's trying to enter the room.
Oh, I see, I see. Okay, there we go. Good morning, Michaela. So we were just talking about how those objections to Darwin's idea were answered. Marie and Pierre Curie have just worked over an entire train car full of uranium ore to extract a new element that's highly radioactive and unstable. So there's very little of it in natural uranium in any given time. It's called radium. This was the stuff that they used to paint on watch dials so that you could read them in the dark. And this is rather tragic. They hired young women to work in these factories where they would use radium paint to paint these watch dials. And some women would lick the brushes and then paint with radium. And it's not one of the more cheerful chapters in American capitalism, because the radium girls all came down with cancer before anybody knew the risks, or, well, more likely cared about the risks. But anyway, so radioactivity gets discovered at the very end of the 1800s. And it turns out that the Earth has got plenty of radioactive elements in it. Now, I actually saw a survey that was taken of scientific literacy, and a surprising number of people thought that radioactivity was entirely man-made. But you 5 ought to know that there is natural radioactivity in the Earth's crust, There's natural radioactivity everywhere. You're all slightly radioactive. We've all got some radioactive phosphorus in our blood. Bananas are rich in potassium, including radioactive isotopes of potassium. Bananas are slightly radioactive. And there's plenty of uranium and other radioactive elements in the crust. And that generates about 80% of the Earth's heat. The remaining 20% is left over from the time the Earth formed, which, for reasons of time, I'm not going to get into. Maybe ask me later if you're dying to know. But 80% of the Earth's heat comes from this natural heater that the Earth has. We've got radioactive elements that keep the volcanoes pumping and the earthquakes happening and all of that stuff. So Kelvin's math wasn't wrong, but he was not aware that there's this extra heat source because at the time he was writing, nobody knew about it. In fact, I will probably not have time to go into the technical details of exactly how this is done. Although, I don't know, if you ask nice, maybe I will at some point if we have time. But we can now directly calculate the ages of at least some rocks. Darwin and Kelvin and people like that had very rough ways of trying to estimate it, but we can now pin things down a lot more precisely. When an igneous rock forms, that's a rock that used to be molten, right? Like volcanic lava that's hardened, for example. When lava hardens, it traps radioactive elements in it, inside that rock. And then the radioactive elements, called parent elements, undergo decay into daughter elements. So if you have a sample of radioactive potassium-40, wait around for long enough and some of it will turn into the daughter element argon-40. In fact, for any given sample of potassium-40, I think it takes 1.25 billion years for half of it to decay into argon-40. Uranium-238 will slowly, through many intermediate steps, decay into lead-206. And uranium-235 will become lead-207. And rubidium-86 will become strontium-86, and so on. And the rates at which these happen are well known. And if you know the rate, or a little better, if you know the half-life, the length of time it takes for half of the sample to decay, then you can measure the amount of parent element and daughter element in a rock, plug that into some algebra, and get an estimate for the age of that rock. And we don't really have time to go into the details of how this, but there are various cross-checks that you can do to check your age estimate for accuracy. You'll hear people calling this radiocarbon dating. That's not quite right, because radioactive carbon is only one of the many elements that can be used here. A lot of rock dating is done measuring the rate of potassium decaying to argon, or uranium decaying to lead, sometimes others. And what that guy's doing is using, I think that's a gas chromatograph, but it's basically an extremely accurate atom count, because all you have to do is count atoms of parent and daughter elements and plug those into an equation, and you can get an age estimate. And there are ways in which you can confirm and test that age estimate. This was first done practically by a guy named Arthur Holmes, who was still an undergraduate at the University of Durham in Northern England, when he first tried doing rocks this way, and he basically got the right answers. We have much more accurate methods now, but his answers were fuzzier, but in the ballpark. He basically did it right. The oldest rocks that he tested turned out to be 1.6 billion years old. The age of the Earth is now known to be 4.6 billion years old. We don't have many rocks on Earth from that time frame because Earth is a dynamic planet, meaning the really old rocks have had over 4 billion years to get melted or buried or crushed or squeezed or eroded into nothing. But we do have some rock samples on Earth that are over 4 billion. I want to say the oldest on the planet is about 4.2. And then rocks that have not come from an Earth environment, like meteorites, punch their clock at about 4.6, and that's about the age of the entire solar system. That's a long time. Put it this way. Imagine you get a 1,000-sheet roll of toilet paper. If you were to unroll that entire roll of toilet paper and just, run it down the hallway, the total length of time that humanity has been in existence is roughly the length of the little fringe on the last sheet of a 1,000-sheet roll of toilet paper. I don't know if that helps you visualize that a little bit better, but yeah, human history, the length of time that our species has been around is almost infinitesimal compared to the total length of time the Earth has been around. Sometime when you're up on the top floor, on one of the walls above the doors, you might notice that some previous class actually painted a timeline of geological time periods. And look at that sometime. There's a big colorful bar that represents the total length of time the Earth has been around. And the total length of time that humanity has been around would be maybe just a couple of millimeters at the very end of that bar. So, Kelvin, by the way, thought that radioactivity must be some sort of hoax, but he was very old at the time. He died pretty soon after the discovery. And that's pretty much it for his objection. He wasn't wrong, he just didn't know about this heat source. Blending inheritance was actually refuted by this guy. This guy who is, of course, Gregor Mendel, who spent years growing peas in the garden of the monastery at Brno in what's now the Czech Republic. And I assume you've heard of him. He published his work in 1865. It wasn't immediately realized what he'd done. It was in kind of an obscure place. He did send out copies to other people. Supposedly he sent one to Darwin, who didn't read it because Darwin was very bad at reading German. This is why you need foreign languages, folks. Every so often, believe it or not, somebody has something worthwhile to say that isn't in English. Amazing, I know. It practically makes me a subversive these days, but it is true. And Mendel never really had a chance to follow up on his 1865 paper because he soon suffered the worst thing that could possibly happen to a scientist. I mean, this is just the worst. You know what's the worst thing that could happen to a scientist? I don't even like to think about it. They made him an administrator. Never do that to me. They'll never take me alive. He ended up becoming the abbot, the head monk of his monastery, and spent most of the rest of his life embroiled in power struggles between the Roman Catholic Church and the government of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and never really was able to get back to his science, unfortunately. But this is what refutes blending inheritance. As you should know, genes are not like blends. right? The idea of genes, Mendel didn't know what these were, but he did know that inheritance depended on these little particles, he called them Elementen in German, elements, these little thingamabobs that are rattling around inside P cells. And you get your traits by having various combination of what we now call genes, which of course come in different alleles. Yes? Strongly recommend if you did a memory dump after taking genetics and you forgot all that stuff, take some time this weekend and go out behind the woodshed and brush up on simple Mendelian traits. Remind yourself what a gene is, what alleles are, maybe do some Punnett squares or something like that, because what is coming up in this class pretty much requires that you have a decently solid background in classical genetics. I'm not going to get impossibly deep, but if you're rusty on that, make sure you know it well. Okay, so Mendel's paper is kind of lying on the library shelves. In the meantime, a German biologist named August Weismann argued very strongly against Lamarckian ideals. And his poor eyesight meant that he couldn't do much in the lab. He was more of a theoretical biologist. But he hypothesized that there was some sort of physical stuff that carries inheritance that he called germplasm. We now call it DNA, basically. But Weismann hypothesized there was some sort of germplasm, and when some other people discovered chromosomes, Weismann was the first to realize that chromosomes were this germplasm stuff that he had hypothesized. And Weismann's hypothesis is sometimes called continuity of germplasm. The germplasm in your gametes is set apart from the rest of your body. The cells that are going to become your eggs or your sperm are set aside very early in development. And once that happens, Weismann said, there isn't any way for any kind of signal from the rest of your body to make it to rewrite your germplasm. You can't rewrite your DNA by bulking up your muscles or anything like that. You can bulk up your muscles as big as you want, but those muscles have no way that they can send some kind of bulking up signal to the DNA that's stored in your eggs or sperm. You could sit around the couch and do nothing but eat Pringles, and your muscles could waste away. But there's no way, says Weismann, that signals from your wasted muscles can reprogram the germplasm that's stored in your eggs or your sperm. That barrier, by the way, is called the Weismann barrier. And it actually still comes up in discussions. People talk about the Weismann barrier when talking about the ethics of things like gene therapy. We are getting to the point where if you have a genetic disease, it's possible, and it's been done experimentally, it's not routine yet, but we're getting to the point where if you have a genetic disease, it's possible to insert a better gene into you, or at least to certain cells, so you can recover from whatever loss of function you have from the bad gene you inherited. There have been a few people successfully treated with this so far. And people who talk about gene therapy still talk about the Weismann barrier when they ask the question, okay, we can engineer the genes in the cells of your body. Is it ethical to engineer the DNA in your eggs or sperm so that not only do you gain new traits from gene therapy, you'll pass those on? And people argue about that. I don't have a particular solution. We can talk about that some other time if you want to. But I just wanted to mention that that Weismann barrier is still relevant, and you still might hear it discussed if you get much into bioethics. Incidentally, Weismann wasn't entirely right, and Lamarck may have been a little bit more correct than he sometimes gets credit for. Maybe I can talk about that a little bit later. But for right now, let's just say that Weismann argued against Lamarckian evolution by arguing that there's no way that the rest of your body can program the DNA that has been set aside in your egg cells or sperm cells. So in 1873, somebody with much better eyesight than poor Weismann was the first to see chromosomes. There were some other people that caught him at about the same time, including a Belgian guy named van Beneden. And these are some of the first drawings of chromosomes. These are cells from, I think this is a salamander tail. And you can no doubt recognize that there's a cell in interphase on the left, and then going to the right, that looks like metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. Right? You did learn this in 1440, right? Yes. Prophase, interphase, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. IPMAT. Yep. So yeah, Schneider's one of the first people to see this. And Weismann argued that these chromosomes are this germplasm. And he was basically right. Chromosomes are long pieces of DNA. Weismann said this is a hereditary substance, a material bearer of hereditary tendencies contained in the nucleus of the germ cells and in that part of it which forms the nuclear thread. He means the chromosomes here. Jumping from Germany to the Netherlands, a guy named Hugo de Vries began some experiments breeding and crossing plants in the Netherlands. Unknown at the time, he replicated some of Mendel's work with different plant species. De Vries did not crossbreed peas, I don't think. He bred evening primroses, rather attractive flowers. Ironically, the Latin name is Enothera lamarckiana. Was named in honor of Lamarck. And doing his breeding experiments on evening primroses, he noticed that every so often you could get sudden changes in color or shape from one generation to the next. Now, people had already observed these in plants and animals, and the usual name for them was sports of nature. De Vries called them mutations. And he argued that mutations meant that traits were not inherited as blends, but they were inherited as some sort of little units, some sort of little particles that got passed on. His word for these, by the way, was intracellular pangenes, which we have since whittled down to just genes. So De Vries is the guy who coins the word gene and who starts documenting mutations, which of course are these changes in a gene. And then in the first half of 1900, De Vries happens to find a copy of Mendel's paper and goes, wow, dang, this is what I was working on all this time. Two other scientists also happened to find it within the first few months of 1900, guys named Correns and Chermak. And they realized that this explained everything, that Mendel had already shown with rigor what they were hot on the trail of, the idea that traits are inherited as little particles that we now call genes, and that genes assort independently, and that disproves Jenkins's blending inheritance. We would now say that if you have a bunch of short-necked giraffes and a tall neck pops up, then when he mates with a short-necked giraffe, he'll pass on tall-necked alleles. And if those alleles are recessive, maybe you won't see them in the next generation, but they're not going to disappear forever. In a few generations, they might eventually come back. So inheritance is not like blending paint. You know, if you pour a drop of white paint or red paint into a bucket of white and you stir, the red paint's gone and you'll never get it back, right? Think of inheritance more as like mixing marbles. If you put a red marble into a jar of white marbles, you can still get the red marble out, right? You can always reach in and pull it out, and the red marble won't be changed. Yes? Inheritance is more like mixing marbles than mixing paint, and that disproves the hypothesis of blending inheritance. Now, there was still, and we'll talk about this in more detail coming up, there was still controversy because Mendel's traits are not continuous. What I mean by that is a pea plant either has purple flowers or it has white flowers. A pea plant is either tall or it's dwarf. It has green seeds or it has yellow seeds. There's only a couple of possible phenotypes, right? You're remembering this? You've heard of peas? Little vegetables? Okay, great. A lot of traits are inherited, but they don't come in just a couple of phenotype states. Height, for example, has a strong genetic influence. Tall people tend to have tall kids and short people tend to have short kids. But people do not all come in either tall or dwarf. You know, we are not all either basketball centers or Kentucky Derby jockeys, right? Some of us are pretty short, some of us are very tall, and most of us are somewhere in the middle. And we don't come in these nice, neat size classes, right? Same is true for build. Same is true for the size of physical features. You know, some people have short fingers and some people have long fingers, but we're not all either Sergei Rachmaninoff or Donald Trump, right? There's a lot of middle ground. And it wasn't immediately clear how genes could be responsible for traits that varied continuously. And so there's controversy for about 20 years between Mendelian geneticists who are trying to explain everything like it's Mendel's peas, and the group called the biometricians that are arguing that Mendel's laws don't apply to everything and there must be other factors going on to explain how continuous traits like height can be inherited. De Vries explained mutations as changes in genes in his book called Die Mutationstheorie, the theory of mutations. He was one of those people we've talked about, a saltationist, who thought that evolutionary change might happen in sudden jumps, and thought that new species might spontaneously appear in a single generation if there was just one mutation that was sufficiently large. He wasn't entirely wrong. Sometimes it does not take a great deal of genetic change to give you a new species. Wild corn is a grass native to central Mexico that has these ears that are about that big. And the seeds have a husk that you have to take off before you can eat them. Domestic corn, of course, the ears might get about that big and they don't have a husk. There's been so much change from wild to domestic that if we didn't know already, we'd probably call those separate species. And yet only 5 mutations are responsible for all of that. So sometimes it doesn't take very many mutations to give you pretty radical change. And that's something else maybe we can get into a little bit later. So you had the, yes?
Or about like hybrids, like donkeys, horses, mules.
Ooh, can I get into that in week 3 or 4? Yeah, we've got a whole lecture coming up on the evolutionary role of hybridization. All right, yeah, good. Hold that thought. Okay, so as I've said, we had a lot of dispute between Mendelians who thought everything was caused by discrete genes like Mendel's peas, and the biometricians who emphasized inheritance of continuous traits and didn't think Mendel's laws could cover that. If we skip over a lot of this, by about 1930, Mendelian genetics has fused with Darwinian natural selection by people like an American named Sewell Wright, who came up with a way to apply Mendelian genetics to Darwinian evolution using mathematics, and worked out an entire mathematical grounding of natural selection that would make it possible to an extent to even predict the consequences of selection in a population. And that produces a powerful body of theory that's sometimes called neo-Darwinism and sometimes called the modern synthesis. And there are ways in which the modern synthesis is very incomplete. There are ways in which it's been extended, debated, modified. Not everything that's important in evolution is the modern synthesis, but it's what we're going to be talking about for the next week. The modern synthesis is basically classical evolutionary biology at this stage. And it's the foundation we've got to lay down before we can go any further. All right, on that note, I'm going to bring up the lights and give you folks a break. It is 9:43. Go ahead and come back at 10 and we'll move on. This is a pretty good place to pause here. So I will now stop the recording and now we can cuss.